Hi, everyone. Welcome to another workshop presentation of the C3EB Summit. We are on day 2, which is talking, and our overall theme for today has been how to build a more culturally competent and more informed citizenry across the board in all of our roles. And of course, we want to go back to corporate leadership because that is an important part, that is an important aspect of informed citizenry. So, one of our panelists, Melissa Álvarez Mangual, from yesterday's morning panel discussion, is back to educate us and enlighten us on how to build DEI&B, that's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness strategies into our business operations and talent development, and how to do it in a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary way, because that is her expertise. So this is going to be an amazing session, whether you're watching this live or you're catching this later. Make sure you drop your comments so that we can get them to Melissa again, whether it's live or later. And, before I introduce Melissa officially, thank you to our sponsors and partners for walking this walk with us and making this summit and future programming possible. Thank you to Essential IT, Defy the Status Quo Marketing, Zanzibar Enterprises, and the Nielsen Company for believing in this mission and for believing in equity, belongingness, and intentional inclusion. With that being said, it is my absolute pleasure to tell you a little bit about Melissa Álvarez Mangual, who has an Ed.D. She is a founder and managing principal at Thriven Partners LLC, and she's been leading learning and organizational development efforts that place inclusion and equity in the center for over 20 years. As a leader, coach, consultant, trainer, and learning designer, Melissa amplifies the value and power of workplace learning to shift mindsets, behaviors, and dynamics. Reviving failing programs, taking highly effective programs to the next level, and establishing data-informed, successful, and sustainable initiatives are her specialties. Melissa is a scholar practitioner who uses an interdisciplinary approach when serving as a thought and accountability partner and a concept to execution driver. She is a certified diversity and business coach who works with leaders ready to take their leadership to the next level, leading inclusively and equitably. Melissa is boldly resolute in her work with leaders for inclusion and equity. She strives for growth and synergy in her engagements while exercising strategic agility to make a difference in organizations and in people's lives. What a beautiful bio. I need to learn to craft bios like that, but that's a totally different conversation. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Melissa back to the C3EB Summit platform. And Melissa, stage is all yours. Take it away.
Thank you for having me, Dr. AJ, and I'll ask that we get the slides put up and then we'll This isn't a DEI 101 webinar. I'm not going to spend time talking about the business case. You can do a Google search and find a whole host of scholarly journal articles and dissertations
Hey, Melissa,
Yes?
just real quick. Oh, we weren't able to hear you this whole time.
Really?
Yeah,
You can hear me now?
yeah. So, do you
That's
mind
unusual.
restarting and let's try this again?
Okay. You didn't hear anything?
Not a single thing so far.
Whoa, that's weird. Okay. But you can hear me now, right?
Yes,
Can you hear me?
yes, we can
Okay.
hear you.
All right. I'm sorry about that. Seems like there was some audio there. All right. So,
We lost you again.
oh my gosh. Okay. Give me one moment to get a different earpiece,
Okay,
and then I'll see if I can get this to work.
all right.
Can you hear me now? Are you able to hear me now? I'm using a different mic.
Yes, yes. Let's try it.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Does it sound okay? It's
yes,
the camera mic.
yes.
Okay. All right, so I'll start over. All right, so I skipped past my bio because Dr. AJ did such an incredible introduction. I don't think you need to hear any more about me. So I'm jumping to terms here. I think it's important that we level set at the start of this and give you an opportunity to see the ways in which I'm thinking about the terms diversity, equity, inclusion when I talk about them. So that's why you see these terms up here. You can read faster than I can speak them. So I'm not going to take the time to read aloud every single one of these definitions. But for the ones that you're not familiar with, please take a look. I'm not going to cover them in depth, in part because this is not a diversity, equity, inclusion 101 webinar. This is kind of next level stuff. I'm also not going to cover the business case because this isn't a 101 workshop. You can find the business case in a whole host of scholarly journal articles, dissertations, professional publication, like magazine type articles, and they almost always start off with the business case. So just do a quick skim if you're not clear on what the business case is, and you can go there, because we're not here to talk about the business case. We're here to talk about what are some strategies for integrating diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into two different spaces within your organization: business operations and talent development. And before you even go there to the strategies, you've got to assess where you are as an organization. And as with any major change initiative, you need to do the work to understand the complexity and the nuance of what it is that you're dealing with in your organization and about to tackle. Of course, my dogs start to bark. Please excuse that. Okay, so each organization is unique. It's its own unique entity with its own blind spots, sore spots, gems, and opportunities. So you've got to start strategically. And although I'm a learning and organizational development professional, offering trainings is not step one, and it's not the final step either. It's an activity that is interdependent on a whole host of other strategies and activities. So you'll need to start with conducting a culture audit, preferably one that also attends to where the organization is on the continuum of readiness to delve into the range of work that can be, basic diversity awareness, depending on where you're at as an organization, through to justice and anti-racism work. And the audit should reveal those blind spots, the sore spots, gems, and opportunities that I mentioned earlier. It should give insight into where the organization is primed and ready to get going and how best to approach it, as well as where you anticipate
meeting up against some resistance, because you're going to meet up against resistance, and the kind of resistance that you're likely to meet up against, so that you can develop a plan to reduce it. This audit and readiness assessment should also give you a sense of how employees are going to adapt to change, so that you can ensure it's tended to in your strategy and your approach. Now, once you've got the results of the audit and the readiness of your organization, then you can begin the work of devising that strategic action plan. This should include a process of developing shared language and a framework that you all will use to understand diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, as well as the social and institutional power and systems that exist within the organization. And you'll need to specify goals at the systems, cultural, and individual levels. The goals that you're going to be driving to achieve. And this is going to be critical in determining the path that your organization will take and the milestones along the way that you're going to work with intentionality to achieve or exceed. In our time together, I'm going to dive into what I deem here as 2 strategic impact areas, specifically for integrating diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into how a business operates and how it develops its people, its talent, right? To be a more inclusive and equitable organization where people really feel like they belong. So those 2 areas are what you see here: business policies and processes, and the corporate culture and practices. The 2 strategic impact areas are highly likely to result in some deeper level organizational change, and they'll require work beyond a one-off training on unconscious bias or any other diversity, equity, inclusion, business belonging topic. It requires systems level and re-engineering and change. And as you know, when you think about change efforts, it's not a small feat. It requires resources. And this is going to require reallocation of existing resources or bringing in other resources to help move this stuff along within the organization, embedded into the way the organization operates. Resources like time, human resources, financial, and it's going to require us to use our imaginations, right? To reimagine how we work and how we go about busting whatever silos exist that may prove as points of resistance. Now, before I dig into the 2 strategic impact areas, I do want to address this thing. There are 2 spaces that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts usually tend to hang out in, and that's recruitment and hiring, or talent acquisition, and training and learning solutions, talent development. These are what people may deem as the easy, quick win spaces to demonstrate having taken some action and made some progress. Talent development is necessary within this systems level reengineering and change, but as part of a more robust, holistic strategic plan. So if talent acquisition and training aren't enough, you're probably asking yourself, well, what is needed then? We're going to talk about that. So there's those 2 impact areas that I mentioned. We're going to dig first into impact area 1, which is business policies and processes. The first thing in this space that I'm going to focus on, and one that often kind of gets dropped by the wayside, is the importance of reevaluating written and those unwritten rules that exist within your organization. So organizations have standard operating procedures and policies that serve as the guideposts for how business is conducted, what's considered acceptable or not. This is a natural place to go deep in analysis because it's written, right? It's written in stone and easily accessible.
All right, so are we ready?
So before digging into policy and procedures, it's recommended to take the time to revisit the organization's values, how they're lived, and to tweak them or overhaul them if necessary. so that they actually enable and ensure inclusion, equity, and belonging as the norm for the organization.
Everyone, welcome to the
When revising the values, it will be important to identify specific behaviors that demonstrate how to live those values in the workplace, so that people can reference those as needed. And then once the values have been reviewed and updated, then you can move into the evaluating of existing policies and procedures for alignment to those values. So when doing this review and the evaluation and updating, it's important that it be done in an inclusive way as possible, really, where you get significant input and feedback from across the organization. You should start by assembling a diverse team. And by diverse, I don't just mean race and gender. I'm also talking about diverse in tenure, in role, in generational representation, sexual orientation, ability, military, and parental status as well. And if you've got a diverse team that represents those different kind of perspectives and experiences, then you can come together and analyze the policies that are most frequently referred to and used when people are asking for support or not for an ask, a case, or a decision. And you'll need to agree once you get that, convene that group of folks together, you need to agree to work with one another in an inclusive way. And that includes acknowledging and course correcting one another when the way you work with the other starts to veer into that exclusionary power hoarding approach that is counterproductive and oftentimes rears its head in team dynamics. So you've got your team or your group together to do that analysis, evaluation. You need to, when you engage in the analysis of the policy procedure wording, you'll also need to take a look at the use cases, the data available on it, whatever other relevant information is available. You can look at how those written rules, formal policies, either advance or hinder the perception of fairness and belonging. You can look at how they are monitored and enforced, and whether the expected outcomes associated with the rules and policies are being achieved, and by whom. The by whom is important in all of this. And while you're doing this, you can also cross-check it all against what really happens on a day-to-day within the organization, those unwritten rules or ways that those things are operationalized and managed. And then you can also set those policies, formal and informal, alongside the business strategy and objectives to determine if they're still aligned or if they need some adjusting. And then, of course, the usual, come to some agreements on whatever the necessary changes are and how they will be communicated, enforced, monitored, and measured. Now, without the accountability piece, all that information, all of that effort in analysis and revision falls by the wayside and becomes what we call a performative exercise. Much like change management initiatives, you are going to need to have champions, you're going to need to have ambassadors, change agents, and folks like that are on board, committed. They have to be resilient because this is tough work, and they have to be respected. And those people must be equipped to show up and do what this change initiative calls on the organization to do. And also what the organization needs to become, right? That's where the talent development comes into play. You start with those change partners, then expand the learning out across the organization. And I'm going to come back to a point I made earlier, which are not going to ensure behavior shifts, enable awareness. So there needs to be some kind of form of reinforcement in exercises, activities, in having accountability partners and groups that meet on a regular basis that are held, accountable to continue that work together, and then recognition efforts that support the shift in how people work with one another. It's also going to be important that it is built into it actually, let me step back a little. It needs to be built into measures and the performance review process as well. That is part of this accountability process.
Do you want to give your own introduction? What I've always been interested in learning from you is, yes, of course,
All right.
important.
My dogs are making it known that they're here today. So the second aspect of this impact area of business policies and processes is that I think it's important to attend to supplier diversity. Suppliers is where you can affect change, and not just internally within the organization, but within your community and outside of your community, wherever the business is. So it's important to take a critical look at supplier diversity across the organization. And these questions here that you see here allow you to do that kind of examination. And I'm not going to read all these questions. That's just here for your reference. But I will point out a few questions that are important to attend to, which is taking a look at which suppliers are most often used and by which departments, what those suppliers' demographic makeup are, from the board, the executives, through to the people who actually provide the service from the vendor. You should also be looking at how do the supplier's values align or not with your business, with your business's values. And then when you're doing that, that helps you to think too a bit about, is this a partnership that you would be proud to state publicly? And if it's not, then you need to question why it is that you're keeping that supplier relationship. You should also consider whether or not your supplier list is skewed towards organizations that are or are not diverse, inclusive, and equitable, how you're justifying that. And when you're doing that justification process, again, look for alignment with organizational values, your strategy and objectives, and then make sure that you are attending to whatever conflicts need remedying. So those are a few things from this list of questions that we have here. And I want to emphasize that this may seem like a lot, and it is, because it's business, right? If you want your business to operate in an inclusive and equitable way where people know and feel they belong, then you've got to invest the energy into ensuring that it's set up so that that can happen. So as you would with any business priority, once you've done this kind of pivotal analysis, you'll need to develop a strategic action plan. One that includes how the necessary changes will be made, by whom, over what period of time, and how you will measure progress. This is where project management comes into play. What will be especially important here is having a balance of suppliers across the organization's needs. And if you think about this, if the consultants and coaches and whatever kind of service providers and what have you that you hire are diverse in experience, in thought leadership, in education and demographics, then there's a high likelihood that you're going to have some major shifts in the organization's results, from decisions and actions through to innovation. And that's going to impact your customer base, which may broaden it. It may expand it and expand the business. So now we're going to go into the second impact area, which is culture and practices. And this is the space where you need to examine how the organization is making life better for as many people as possible. Now, there are a whole host of things that come into play in corporate culture and practices, but we don't have the time for that here to cover all of that. So what I've done is I've selected the four areas that are often mentioned briefly or just not at all, and they really matter. And so we're gonna talk about these 4 areas just a little bit. The first one I want to cover is ensuring there's, well, not ensuring, but part of making it part of the culture that it is okay to support, and it is expected that you will be an active bystander or active version of yourself in whatever situation you are in the workplace. So we're hearing more and more about microaggressions, which are also referred to as subtle acts of exclusion, or SAEs. These usually come in the form of brief commentary, lines of questioning, or moments where someone's voice is not being heard, or they feel excluded, right? If it's a subtle act of exclusion. The experience raises eyebrows. It often results in awkward silence or attempts to laugh it off. And it causes confusion for people about intent. But the impact is usually discomfort or harm. These microaggressions most often are directed and experienced by women, LGBTQ+ folks, Black, Indigenous people of color, and people with disabilities. Our organizations might offer a webinar or lunch and learn that brings this up. But most people get how daily microaggressions can be fatiguing, but we aren't holding each other to account to stop the slights, the offenses as they come up. And organizations need to urge, and not just urge, but need to set the expectation that supporting one another when witnessing those subtle or not so subtle acts of exclusion and othering is expected. And the staff need to know that it is acceptable to interrupt, to disrupt those situations in a way that preserves the working relationship. And people need to practice doing this active bystanding because it's not all that natural in the workplace. And they need to practice this in safe spaces. This is where talent development comes in. Like I said, a one-off training will make people aware, but if you make it an ongoing effort over a set period of time, with tasks of putting their new learning to use, working through the discomfort in the moment, and with a set of peers, afterwards, you can build up your staff's confidence and their courage to disrupt those acts of exclusion. Simulations via mobile learning can be helpful as a complement, right, to that process over time. But it has to be part of a more robust learning. Transparency. This is another important area in the corporate culture and practices. When transparency at all levels of the organization, from the board to the C-suite onto the frontline workers, is taking place, you build trust. Trust will undermine your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work with a quickness. You need to work intently on being transparent about what the organization is considering doing, what it's considering working on, and even what it needs to do and how it's going to go about doing those things. Now, the internal communications piece is just as important as how you communicate outside the organization to your customers, shareholders, and other stakeholders. You may be thinking this is a no-brainer, and organizations are already mostly doing this on the internal communications front. Sure. And this is a both and that work needs to have diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at the center of it. And I don't mean making position statements in difficult moments nationally or locally. What I'm referring to here is using principles of cultural competence in the development of your communication strategy, in the communication mechanisms, in what and how it is that you are communicating, along with the message itself. Next, multidimensional feedback. When you launch something internally or externally that's going to impact or involve others, you have a responsibility to bring them along in the design and the development. You want to be getting feedback that is multidimensional, not just on one aspect of that thing you're going to launch, from every dimension. And get that feedback from as diverse a group as possible so you can get ahead of any potential landmines or triggers and set it up for optimum results. You may want to move quickly to get it done, but if you don't get that multi-dimensional feedback, what you put out will be a flop or it's going to be short-lived. Oops. Let me go back. Oh, something's not showing up right here. So the next thing is to integrate into advancement. If as an organization, you have it as a value or a priority, not simply to be diverse, but to be culturally competent, inclusive, equitable, and a place where your employees know and feel like they belong, then your practices need to align with those values and business priorities. So you've got to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into how people advance through the organization. You've got to integrate it into the policies and procedures, as we discussed earlier, as well as the acceptable practices for making those advancement decisions and how people in decision-making roles are accountable to doing it. So you've got to tie it to bonuses and raises, as you do with other business priorities. Now, culture shifts, culture change, that takes careful thought, strategic action, and follow through. And it takes a willingness to disrupt. Every organization is chasing innovation in some form. In order to stay relevant and profitable, some aim to be disruptors. Either way, it requires intentionality, bravery, and risk-taking. This is the opportunity to put that energy to good use. Now this slide may take some of you back. Others who have been steeped in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space and answering this work are probably familiar with it. The words white supremacy have long been painful, jarring, and a touchy subject, and most often is associated with hate. And while that is certainly one way in which white supremacy shows up, there are other ways as well. In Tima Okun's work, who is a white woman, she acknowledges boldly at the very beginning how it was, at least as a white presenting woman, she acknowledges at the beginning how her kind of framework that she shares with us is informed by so many diverse scholars and thought leaders before her, and she builds upon their work. Now, the supremacy part of these white culture characteristics is what is most problematic, in that it places the utmost value on this one way of operating. That these ways are used as the norms and standards for how we show up, how we interact and do things in the workplace, without explicitly naming it, interrogating it, or even enabling people in the workplace to choose ways of being. So as we think about integrating diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into business operations and talent development, we have a responsibility to take off those blinders, to interrogate our organizational culture for the ways that white supremacy is present, or supremacy of any sort is present, and determine how we're going to co-create culture that is more inclusive and that will result in belongingness. Now, there are 13 white supremacy characteristics, culture characteristics in organization that Okun shares. And you'll only see 7 here, in part because it's a brief, webinar. And I want to highlight the ones that are most often getting in the way of or serving as blocks to enabling the full benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I appreciate most about Okun's work is that she offers antidotes to the white supremacy culture characteristics. These are alternative ways to be or do in order to be inclusive. And on this slide, you'll see the characteristic listed in a bolded kind of phrasing. And then the antidote, 1 or 2 antidotes are noted just below. She gives you more than that in the actual article. So it's really would be worthwhile to take a look at the full article for the wealth of information and resources she shares. Now, I'm going to just cover a couple of them. So the sense of urgency, this one is a very common one, especially across sectors, where we're just pushing to move as fast as we can, which then makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive, to encourage thoughtful decision making, and even think long term to consider the consequences. It also results in sacrifice for that quick or highly visible result that you're working towards. So here you'll see realistic work plans as an antidote. Seems kind of obvious, but it's one that we aren't so good at. We set these work plans with goals and timelines that are aligned with that sense of urgency, and then those things usually get pushed back or something is sacrificed in order to meet that deadline, right? Well, wherever possible, we need to be developing realistic work plans that take into account things take longer than anyone ever expects. Another one I want to cover is paternalism. This is related to decision making, and that decision making using paternalism is clear to the people who have the power, but unclear to the people who don't have the power. And those who do have power tend to think that they are capable of making decisions for or know the interests of those that don't have power. That's why you see that kind of parent-child icon there to reflect the paternalism and how it shows up in the workplace. And the last one I'll cover is objectivity. This is that belief that there's such a thing as being objective or neutral. It's what it is it shows up as invalidating people who show emotion, and having like impatience with anyone that doesn't appear logical, right? Logical and under your terms. And an antidote for that is to realize that everybody has a worldview, and their worldview does in fact affect the way that they understand things. So as an organization that's prioritizing the integration of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into your business operations and talent development, examining and interrogating the ways that organizational culture your organizational culture may be perpetuating white supremacy will be key, I think, to establishing more inclusive cultural norms and practices, and to cultivate and embed it in the day-to-day. Now this one that I'm going to cover next is an area where there is potential for deeper impact, and that's decision making. This is what I call an impact area cross-cutter, because it falls in both areas 1 and 2, the business processes and procedures, as well as the culture and practices. And leaders and individual contributors make decisions all throughout the day. Some decisions that are more impactful than others, sure, but all of them affect how the organization and its people work, internally and externally. So decision making has everything to do with how inclusive and equitable the organization is and whether people feel they belong. Where the organization can start is setting some standards for how the business approaches decision making, similar to the values, the decision-making approach or considerations set the expectations for what is acceptable or not. The standards for decision-making should be aligned with the values, the mission, and business objectives. And having those standards, this is something I want to make sure I kind of punctuate. So having those standards does not take away the decision maker's ability to make the decision. What it does is make explicit the processes that are used for making decisions and expectations on how impact is considered when making the decision. So with the decision-making standards in place, decision makers now have something beyond what they would typically see and do to hold them to account for doing it, whatever it is that they're trying to do, in a way that is inclusive and equitable. And similar to a decision-making tree, you'll see here, if this clicking stuff works. An approach decision makers can take to position themselves personally to stretch, grow, and make decisions in an inclusive and equitable way, while at the same time using their power within the organization to affect change. So the first one after the standards is mapping. This is where you can take a look at your upcoming decisions, the relevant policies, procedures, and practices, and give some thought to how, it's important, I think, to give some thought to how in that particular situation, it would usually be handled, how it would usually get done, and think about whether that's aligned with the standards, and if it's not, then attend to the ways in which it's exclusionary.
Yeah, and so
then after doing that kind of decision mapping, you need to take a look at impact analysis. Who's going to be impacted by this decision? You know, you got to think about that. Who should you be engaging? And this is kind of returning back to that representative group that we talked about earlier. I'm thinking about tenure, role, level, people's diverse lived experiences and stuff. And you should be thinking about, is there over representation or under representation on your list? And also, what are the business practices that might be affected or impacted from this decision? Once you've done that, you got to look at yourself. You got to do a self-assessment. And you know yourself well. You can determine what is easy and challenging for you about this process. And once you do that, you know, make some notes for yourself. Cross-check it with Okun's white supremacy culture characteristics in organizations and the respective anecdotes. Don't forget about the anecdotes. Those are the really important part of that framework. And then once you've looked at that, identify one or two of those areas that you're going to be intentional about working on in this process of making this upcoming decision. And also thinking through, you know, what are the ways you're going to course correct if you need to. Similar to what we spoke about earlier in the impact area on policies and procedures, you'll need to convene folks. You're going to need to do the work to get a representative group of stakeholders together to inform your decision. You ought to be transparent about that decision, what you're committing to in making the decision, and even in convening the group. What values and standards you'll align to and actually use in that effort that you're bringing everyone together to. And then you'll be charged with actually leading inclusively and equitably. This part is where transparency comes up again. Transparency is important throughout this full process, and especially important when you're leading in an inclusive and equitable way. So share the characteristics and anecdotes that you've identified for yourself and that you will intentionally focus on, and invite the group to serve as accountability partners to you. Invite them to even use this opportunity to stretch themselves, to also show up in a more inclusive and equitable way for their own and even for others' growth and well-being. And this will engender belonging. It'll be part of the process of engendering belonging. So you do that, then you also need to agree on how you're going to hold one another to account. Because we can say, oh, I want you to be my accountability partner, but if that person doesn't know how to hold you accountable, what's okay, or what's going to be hard for you and how to approach that, then they can't really do that well. So it's going to be important that you agree to how you're going to hold one another to account, how you're going to give and receive constructive feedback on the impact versus intent. And then make sure to make note of it and do it with each other in those spaces. And then lastly is integrate. I know the last click, something's wrong with the animation. So integrate. While you're doing all of this, it's going to be important to look for and create ways to integrate what it is that you all are learning and doing within the system. Put it into the system. And then identify some opportunities that present and seize them. And consider your spheres of influence and control as individuals, as well as those spaces where you can influence and control as a collective, and tap into those. And I have a guide, kind of workbooky thing on my website that you can download for free and access when you're ready to dig into this kind of decision-making process. And lastly, integration into talent development is key. Like, you can put all these things into policies and procedures and imagine this new way of culture and everything, but you also have to get your people ready and equipped and supported to be able to do so. So in thinking about talent development and what it will take to do all of that, to update the policies and procedures, shift the organizational culture, we have to work on this in ways that go beyond the basic diversity, equity, and inclusion training that are most often offered. And so what I'm suggesting here is that there are 4 dimensions of showing up to the work and doing the work, whether it's independently or with one another, that you can see here, that can actually be integrated into the design of any training or learning solution. So 4 dimensions. The first one here is awareness and presence. So if you're designing a training and facilitating one, you can embed this in it. This involves people learning how to attend to the importance of being both self and other aware, how to be fully present, how to notice and give attention to the language that we're using, our behaviors, thoughts, and perspectives, and how those are impacting you, others in the situation. Praxis. Whatever action we take should be only after critical reflection. And that would not just be an individual doing some critical reflection, but doing it also in partnership with people who are unlike you, so you have a different perspective that you're learning from. And then return to or link to the organization's values. The third dimension is sustainability. This is giving consideration to how what is about to be done or put into place can be sustained, and what it's gonna call on your colleagues to do to sustain it. So that's considering the well-being of others in doing this, and then also the return on investment. And lastly, accountability. It comes up throughout my whole talk. This is what's agreed upon, committed to, done, or put into place. Really ought to have clear, equitable ways that the individual, others, the group, and the organization, and by organization I mean like through policies and procedures, are going to hold each other accountable to doing whatever it is that the training is calling out folks to do, and doing it with care. So if we attend to these 4 dimensions of inclusive and equitable cultures and talent development, regardless of the subject matter, we will likely move the organization further along and quicker towards its diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging goals. That concludes my talk. I would love to connect with folks who are on live with us, or those of you who watch the recording afterwards. You have my website information there and my LinkedIn for us to connect. And I thank you all for your time. I look forward to speaking with you all.
Thank you, Melissa, for sharing your presentation and for giving us some really good, I found that actually really helpful when you're trying to put some things into place, or you're not real sure kind of where to go, what to do, that you provided some really good pointers there and thought and very well thought out and planned out. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Also want to just throw up Melissa's website again. She did mention that free worksheet that is on her site, just in case you want to go and find that. And thank you for sharing your wonderful talents and skills with us this evening, again, as you joined us yesterday. And then I also want to thank all of our partners for their help and support throughout the entire summit. And join us for our next one here in the next few minutes. And we look forward to helping you continue to grow.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa.
Mm-hmm.